One of the biggest things that business leaders get wrong is not being prepared to provide the access to yourself that a chief of staff will need. A chief of staff's going to have to onboard. They're going to have to deeply understand you. They're going to have to deeply understand your business. They're going to need to see pretty clearly like your processes and your systems. They're going to need you to open up from a personal perspective. These are my strengths and my opportunities, and here's how I like to work, and here's my quirks or whatever it might be. You've got to be prepared to onboard that chief of staff, give them access, because ideally they are running the show for you in categories of your business that don't make sense for you to be overseeing and managing with such a high touch as you were before.
Maggie Olson, welcome to the root of all success. I'm really glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, so I don't usually accept guests who are pitched to me only because I'm booked so far out into the future. But when your team reached out to me and said, "Hey, we love to have Maggie come on your show," I made an exception. And the reason I made an exception is because I have been thinking about bringing on a chief of staff in my company. And I don't know much about that process. All I know is I know government officials have chiefs of staff. I know some big time organizations do, and I'm a little organization, but when I hired my assistant a year and a half ago, I actually put in the ad was that this would be an administrative assistant position, but kind of like chief of staff. That's what I'm going to build it to. So I haven't done it yet. And my current assistant, while amazing, probably not chief of staff. That's not her thing. She's much better at other things. I don't know that that's her thing. So how would I know if I even need a chief of staff?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I love that you're considering a chief of staff. Thanks for having me. I have an excellent PR team, and I think they saw something in you that they wanted me to come on and join you. So I'm thrilled to be here. And it's really, really good timing that you're considering a chief of staff. So how does a business leader know they need a chief of staff? What I tell business leaders is that they will know that they need a chief of staff if they are really, really busy, heads down, chasing executional work and follow-ups and executing on their most important initiatives. And they feel like they probably aren't spending enough time with their eyes up, looking forward at what they should be spending their time on: vision, growth, strategy, and leadership. You mentioned, you have an executive assistant, you're considering, having growth into a chief of staff role. I really don't generally recommend combining those two roles. They're really different skill sets. An executive assistant is known for and excellent at so many things. It's also a breadth role. It's also kind of like that really capable generalist role. But an EA focuses on inbox, scheduling, logistics, travel, expenses at the core of what they do. And then they stretch and they cover a lot of special projects and other things that you need as well. But it's really day-to-day logistical support. A chief of staff is a business leader's right-hand strategic thought partner that executes the business leader's most important initiatives, that leads many of them, that prioritizes, manages, delegates, tracks their most important initiatives, that drives alignment across their executive team or whoever, whatever team that you may have that needs visibility into everything you're doing. And a chief of staff really can act as proxy and advisor to you depending on their seniority level, which can range really, really broadly. So I'll stop there. How does all that sound?
Well, so that you answered a couple of future questions I've got written down I was going to ask, but the difference between the EA and the chief of staff, I think you've explained. But if I did want to transition someone who's in an EA position into chief of staff, what am I looking for to determine if that's even possible? Because I've already admitted that I don't know that she's the right person. Again, that's no attack against her abilities, and she's amazing, but I don't know that that's her thing. How would I make that determination?
Chief of staff is one path for executive assistants, but executive assistants can have a lot of different paths. EAs have access and practice and experience leading many different things depending on their company structure. So maybe it's social media or marketing or HR or events. Chief of staff could be really good for an EA who absolutely loves supporting a senior leader, who's kind of that driven achiever type. I don't know if you're big on the Enneagram, but it's kind of like those twos. Those threes wing two. I'm a 3 wing 2. Really good at supporting other people, but like takes action, achiever, driven. wants more responsibility, is fast, capable, collaborative, extremely high EQ is super important. As a chief of staff, you are dealing with a lot of different stakeholders at all times, and you have to be able to lead influentially quite often. So that's really, really important. And truly, it's just that desire to take on more responsibility and the ability to figure it out, no matter what that might be, and to have the confidence to step into a role where it's a much different role than EA. So the transition can be difficult. Here's the thing. EAs can absolutely reach and take on some chief of staff responsibilities, but when they're combined and when an EA is also doing those like day-to-day logistical things, they don't have enough time to be an effective chief of staff because and we can kind of dive in more and more to what a chief of staff does, but a chief of staff needs to be able to pull back from the business and see your whole business and your whole back office, like your leadership team and your processes really, really clearly, and have the time and ability to flex into solving problems from left to right, depending on what those different things are. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful, but the real core characteristics of a great chief of staff are folks who can just like achieve and drive and take on a bunch of things and learn quickly and really want to do an excellent job for you as your number two.
So we're talking with Maggie Olson on the show today. She is the founder of Nova Chief of Staff, which is the first of its kind premier training, certification, and development company for chiefs of staff. And she did this after transitioning as a chief of staff from T-Mobile, kind of to her own, kind of doing her own thing. So tell me, Maggie, a little bit about that transition for you, where you were hired at T-Mobile not to be the chief of staff, but something else. And then eventually you became the chief of staff to their, I think it was their T-Mobile business group. And then you ended up building a team and a whole structure that supported 5,000 employees. It was a big deal. So what were you hired as, and then how did you transition into that role?
Yeah, I led big teams early in my career. So I was a people leader early on in my early 20s and throughout my 20s. I'm 38 now, and I worked in food and beverage and I worked in retail, leading teams on sales floors and food and beverage floors. So I had this early leadership experience. I then was a buyer at Nordstrom, loved that work. I moved around to 5 different buying offices. I now think of it akin to consulting, where you go into a completely different business, you learn it, you have to really gain buy-in, you change some things, you make it more efficient, and then you get promoted and move to the next one. I loved that work. During my time at Nordstrom as a buyer, I ended up going back to school and got my MBA from the Foster School of Business in Seattle. I'm a Seattle gal for the last, 35 of my 38 years. I'm in Lincoln, Nebraska now. And when I finished my MBA, I ended up getting recruited into this executive development program at T-Mobile that required early leadership experience. So you had to have led teams of 50 plus before you were even graduated from your MBA program. And I was hired on to this executive development program where myself and like 4 others in my year were basically tasked to move to a new city to lead a business you've never led and find success. So I moved to Salt Lake City. I led a team of retail stores and drove success across, I had about 100 employees and had to continually prove that I was doing a good job in my business. And then I moved into a retail strategy role as my next rotation. And then I found myself in the chief of staff role. So I'll pause there. There's probably a little bit more to add on, but I can walk you through what's next from the chief of staff perspective.
So it's interesting because weren't you the first chief of staff for that particular position at T-Mobile?
Yeah. So it was my first time being in a chief of staff role. I'd never heard of the role chief of staff. I heard things like driving alignment across the team and getting the leader's back office organized and reducing the chaos and ensuring that he's functioning higher and more capably than he ever has. And I'm like, ooh, those things sound cool. Not sure what a chief of staff is otherwise, but sounds great. So I ended up accepting that role after my rotation was done. It's chief of staff's a high trust role. So I'd already had a relationship with him in terms of like just a little networking and meeting through my interview process. And so that sort of helped me get in the door. And I was his first chief of staff. It was my first chief of staff role. I had the privilege of building an entire chief of staff team for his back office. So from business planning to engagements and events and communications and employee culture, I essentially built out many roles, responsibilities, templates, best practices, and all the things for his back office. And we were recognized. We did a really, really good job. And at that point, I was ready. I kind of had the entrepreneurial hat on after my MBA program. And I was trying to think, what could I do to build my own business? And I thought, I think I'm going to do chief of staff consulting, fractional chief of staff consulting. Sounds great. So I'm sitting on my mom's couch talking to her about what I wanted to do, moving out of T-Mobile. And I told her, what's crazy is that there's thousands of project management certifications out there, but nothing for chiefs of staff. And she said, well, why don't you go build it? So that's how Nova came about. I built a chief of staff certification course.
And when was that? What year did you start that?
So that we launched in 2023 summer, but I built the course for about 15 months before we launched it.
Yeah. So now that you've had this experience, not only being a chief of staff, how long were you actually chief of staff?
Almost 2 years.
2 years. So you had 2 years experience of being chief of staff. Then you spent 15 months developing this program. Now you've run in the program for the last year and a half or so, right? A couple years. And now, what have you seen where a business owner completely miscasts a chief of staff? And and what's the biggest mistake that you're seeing entrepreneurs make when they are attempting to fill this role, if you've seen that?
Oh, for sure. There's a lot of components around being ready for a chief of staff. It doesn't have to do with your business size. It doesn't have to do with what you're grossing. It doesn't have to do with the industry you're in or how many employees you have. As I mentioned, it has to do with all the ideas that you have and you feeling like you're not spending enough time on the most important parts of your business and that you need a strategic partner focused on you. So the EA role and the chief of staff role are focused on the human, where, for example, the chief operating officer, CMO, HR, those roles are focused on the company. So that is a little bit of differentiation. The chief of staff supports you as the business leader. So you have to be ready for this chief of staff. And one of the biggest things that business leaders get wrong is not being prepared to provide the access to yourself that a chief of staff will need. A chief of staff is going to have to onboard. They're going to have to deeply understand you. They're going to have to deeply understand your business. They're going to need to see pretty clearly your processes and your systems. They're going to need you to open up from a personal perspective. These are my strengths and my opportunities, and here's how I like to work, and here's my quirks, or whatever it might be. You've got to be prepared to onboard that chief of staff, give them access, because ideally they are running the show for you in categories of your business that don't make sense for you to be overseeing and managing with such a high touch as you were before.
So what is if a CEO doesn't hire a chief of staff, what's the most painful consequence they're going to face?
A lot of teams, I don't know if you've heard the term idea whiplash. So CEOs are visionaries, business leaders are visionary leaders. There's a lot of ideas all the time. I'm in this business leader space now as well. Ideas for this, ideas for that. I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this, or check this out. Just tons of ideas all the time. That can create a chaotic back office for your leadership team. It can create a lot of distraction and what I like to call idea whiplash, where we're looking one way, then we're looking the other. And it's okay, what are we focused on? But here's the thing. We want leaders to stay in that space. That is why you are running a company. That is why you are a visionary leader. It's important that you stay in that space. If you are that person and you don't have chief of staff support, where do these things land? Where do they land? A chief of staff takes your most important initiatives, they capture them, they prioritize them, they circle back with you, they make sure that things are being actioned or deprioritized, they give you visibility into everything that you're asking for and telling your team. That's a huge part of the chief of staff role. I call it executive project management, and it's an approach we teach and take in, how I train chiefs of staff in our course, essentially a strong project management approach to most of how you interact with your leader and how you take control of a lot of the tasks at hand, especially those idea-driven, many initiatives that leaders throw out all the time.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think what was interesting that you said a few minutes ago about we have to be ready to give access. And it would seem like if a chief of staff is not, or a CEO is not giving access, that's going to be a problem one way or the other. Before we continue this conversation, because I want to talk a little bit more about Nova and what Nova does, but I want to talk about our sponsor for today's episode. Business infrastructure is important. That's what we're talking about today with Maggie. But your banking business and your infrastructure around how you handle your finances is really important as an entrepreneur. And I am really glad to say that a couple of years ago, I found Relay. And Relay has been my banking partner now for the past couple of years, and it has changed everything about what we do as a system, as a company, and how we handle our money. Relay automates income into and segments it out to the different accounts that I want it to go to. So whether I want some of it to go to profit, some of it to go to owner comp, some of it to go to operating expenses, it automatically puts it in the right buckets. And that way I log in, I can see how much money is allocated in every spot, and cash is starting to stack. And then there's also ways that you can do same day ACHs if you're in their pro plan. But all of this is unbelievable and easy to use and looks amazing. It's so easy on their app and on the web. Go check it out at therealjasonduncan.com/relay, therealjasonduncan.com/relay. When you bank with Relay, you're going to come back and say, thank you, Jason. I love this. So Maggie, a lot of business owners are hesitant to give up control. And you've built your business, Nova Chief of Staff, on the idea that you're training the people they're giving control up to, right? You give it some, so not total control, but you're giving control. So what exactly is Nova doing? Are you only training people who want to be chiefs of staff, or are you also placing them?
Yeah, good question. We do both. Our flagship product that we launched with, that we've got, nearly 1,000 students across 30 countries, is our online chief of staff certification course. And, giving up a little control is one way to put it. Another way to put it is allowing the business leader to do what they do best, and also preparing them in the best way possible to make them efficient as a leader. So what we do at Nova is we've got 50, 60 hours in our course that is required to gain certification. It's self-paced, it's online. We've got over 500 of our, the biggest companies across the world enrolled in our course, with high-level executive assistants and current chiefs of staff, aspiring chiefs of staff, future entrepreneurs, business operations leaders, et cetera. And what we do is we essentially have built this course with hands-on practice as the key focus for our students. So our students are building briefs so that their leader can be prepared for every single thing they walk into. They are writing strategic recommendations so that through clear documentation and everything else, chiefs of staff and aspiring chiefs of staff can see things clearly enough to say, hey, wait a minute, I think we need to consider a session where we think about our operational efficiencies, because we're not talking about today's business. We're only looking back and looking forward. Chiefs of staff should be strategically recommending improvements to the business all the time. We train chiefs of staff in a lot of other hands-on ways, like throwing complex offsites and all hands events, and ghostwriting for their leader, presenting visually, verbally, digitally, mock meetings, investor updates, like the list goes on, but it's all real life scenarios based on what chiefs of staff do every day. So it's pretty incredible. We've got rave reviews, and folks leave our course telling us that they feel more confident than they've ever been, that they can do the chief of staff job, that they're validated that they're already doing it, and that they're resourced with roadmaps and frameworks and 30 plus templates to really hit the ground running and feel like they can accomplish a lot as a chief of staff.
What is the and if it changes based on other things, what's the cost of going through the certification program? Somebody says, I want to do this because I want a job as a chief of staff. What does that cost to go through the program?
It is $1,850 this year. So there won't be price changes for the rest of 2025. We usually do a price increase at the end of the year for the next year. And we also do placement. So we work with business leaders to find them chiefs of staff. We do coaching and consulting. And we also teach in person now. So a conference company reached out to us last year and they said, hey, we're seeing what you're doing in this market. We want you to teach your certification in person at our conferences. And we had our first one this past October. And we have 3 more this year where we train people live across the 3-day format.
Well, congrats. That's awesome. I love to hear that. What about the placement? How does that work? I'm sure there are people listening to this, watching the show, that are like, hey, I need a chief of staff. How do you help person find someone like that?
Yeah, so we work with the business leaders to understand who you are, what you need, how you work, And we help you understand the chief of staff role. And then we go out and use our extensive network of hundreds of thousands of folks and find you an excellent chief of staff. We do all the interviewing. We, deliver on a nice little shiny platter, 2 to 4 candidates. We help you decide if you're looking for help. We, essentially like work through the whole process with you as a normal kind of recruiting relationship would, and pass off final candidates. And hopefully you choose one. That's kind of how it works.
And how do you charge like a percentage of, like recruiters typically do, of the salary?
Yep. We're around 20% of first year salary, but that can be fluid dependent on if you prefer just a set fee or a percent of first year salary. So it can be worked out.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because the
Yeah.
the sizes of businesses that have chiefs of staff. I know you said earlier it doesn't matter about team size or revenue, and I'm certainly not disagreeing with that as a concept, but really, I mean, at what point should you consider it? Because a chief of staff is not an EA; it is a different level of employee that would also require a different level of compensation. So, at what point would somebody be saying, "Okay, it's time to start looking at this"?
You want to be able to afford a chief of staff ranging, from about 140,000 to maybe 250, depending on your industry, your location, et cetera. And I think the other side of that is it just depends on your needs and your company structure. I work with companies all across the country and chiefs of staff all across the country. And some of the most successful startups out there, chief of staff's like employee number 5. And then, of course, there's companies with hundreds of employees that don't have chiefs of staff. There's an awareness opportunity. So I'm out there yelling from the rooftops what a chief of staff does, why chiefs of staff are impactful. And I always recommend that you first hire executive assistant support, because you absolutely do not want to be doing your own emails and scheduling and all of those day-to-day logistics as a business leader. So figure out your EA support first, and then really determine if it's time for you and if you can afford to hire a chief of staff and what that impact could look like on what you're able to focus on.
So, what would you say to an entrepreneur who is hesitant to hand over the reins to a chief of staff? What would you say to that person?
I would say that you're not necessarily handing over the reins. The chief of staff role can look very, very different dependent on so many different factors: the business leader, the industry, the product, how the business runs, like the life cycle of things. It can look very different. You as the business leader would still own what you need to own. There's no question. However, you're going to feel more prepared. You're going to be spending your time on less on things that don't matter as much. Like, you do need to have that mindset of like, I'm ready to spend my time a little bit more on the high reward things, right? Like business development, leadership of the team, growth, 5-year planning, product development, if you're, a product focused company, right? So you're not giving up control over those important things. You are walking into a room more prepared. You're letting somebody else figure out your meeting cadence with your executive team. You're ensuring your executive team has visibility into everything you're doing, because you haven't been able to give that in the past. You're too busy. You're making sure that you're not the one overseeing events anymore, like all hands. You're letting the chief of staff do that and get approvals from you. You're still in the know. You're still approving, but you're not doing the heavy lifting. So you're still engaged in the business, and a good chief of staff is going to ensure that you are engaged in the business and you do have visibility into the things that matter, but that you're spending your time on the things that really only the CEO or the business leader should be doing.
So, being a chief of staff, I think you said, is like managing the chaos behind the scenes. So, as a chief of staff, a former chief of staff, as someone who trains chiefs of staff, what's one of the dirty little secrets about business and executive leadership that most people wouldn't realize?
Well, some people know this and some people don't, but a lot of times executives aren't great leaders. They've gotten into leadership roles because they have incredible companies, or they're really, really smart and they've moved quickly, right? But they may not have leadership experience, and they may not have ever cared to really develop that part of them because they're working on other things. So a chief of staff is a way also to hire for that opportunity of yours. So if it's a dirty little secret, it's probably one that some of us already know, that business leaders aren't always the best leaders, even though they're running, sometimes like very, very, very large companies.
Well, and you're working with really high-powered executives all the time. I would ask you, what's the one thing in your opinion that separates the really good leader from one who's just playing CEO?
Caring about people, spending time on people, asking them how they're doing, how they feel, and making business decisions that show they care about their people.
Yeah. That's really good insight. Well, let me ask you a personal question about this, and not too personal, but what's a moment in your career, especially maybe as a chief of staff, where you had this moment of realization, I'm completely out of my depth here. I don't know what I'm doing. And like, what, tell us about that moment and what you did with it.
I think that some other people on like listening along would maybe be like, "Oh yeah, me too." There. Well, when COVID happened, there was a lot of activities that nobody planned for, and one of those was return to office. And across companies everywhere, chiefs of staff were often tapped to lead like return to office initiatives or COVID response initiatives for their companies, or at least for their business units. And that was absolutely something that I was like out of my depth in. I didn't understand like where do we even start. So I was on a COVID response team, and then I was on a return to office team representing really the whole company, trying to decide on a whole company, by the way, of 100,000 employees, trying to figure out what are our rules, how do they align, what are the Washington State rules, what are all 50 state rules, because we've got employees everywhere. What do we want to mandate? What shouldn't we mandate? How does this settle, like, politically, like all of the things that and the thing is, chiefs of staff are always stepping into opportunities where they've never been before. And what makes a chief of staff strong is the ability to figure it out and to kind of stay calm through it. So I was definitely like, okay, this is a first, but it was a first for many. And, we figured it out, and I'm better for it.
Are you happy that you left corporate America to be your own thing, kind of do your own deal?
Yeah. I had a little baby 2 years ago. So I'm now able to have the flexibility to work, 11 to 5 or so, and spend time with my husband, who's an evening news anchor, and my little guy in the mornings. And just the flexibility is so wonderful. The ability to just own and decide and influence every part of my business is really, really fun. Chiefs of staff are build mode people. They like to build and then solve another problem and build again. So I love that part of entrepreneurship. I absolutely wouldn't trade it, but I also learned so much from working in the corporate world. Nordstrom, T-Mobile, both great companies. Learned to lead, learned what leaders were like, learned a lot about process and improvements and all the things. So I wouldn't change anything, but I'm glad to be an entrepreneur now.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the club. We're glad you're
Thank
here.
you.
So, what do you think is if you look at the success you've experienced with Nova so far, what's the one thing that you say has unlocked that success for you more than anything else?
You know, I'm gonna say two things, but I think they're related. My career is based in about 20 years of customer experience focused work, food and beverage, technology, retail, all about the customer experience. And when I get goosebumps thinking about what we're doing at Nova and how successful we've been, I really believe that it comes down to one thing, and that's an excellent product, which is built based on the foundation of excellent customer experience. We have incredible reviews. Every time I read or check in with a student, I'm like, what are they going to say? And it just continues to be really, really strong. And an excellent product speaks for itself. So that is what continues to blow me away.
And how do you personally define that word success?
Um, I have spent a lot of time on this over my 38 years. And I think personally, success is when you can do something that brings you joy every single day, and that you've built your life in a way that allows for that.
Oh, I love it. Well, by that definition, do you consider yourself successful?
I do. Yeah.
Congratulations on that. Well, I want you to put your advice giving hat on. So, what's the
Okay.
best piece of advice that you could give to an entrepreneur listening to the show who wants to scale their business, but really doesn't know how to let go of the reins of everything they're doing and the control and being involved in the mix?
Yeah. I would say, I guess it could go twofold. My advice to entrepreneurs, without trying to, sell you on the chief of staff role at all, is just the power of partnerships. I'm a new entrepreneur just the last couple of years, and partnerships have propelled us, just in kind partnerships where somebody promotes, Nova into their LinkedIn network on behalf of just believing in it being a good product, and shared resources in that way. Like, partnerships have really driven Nova growth. In terms of the chief of staff side, like, what kind of advice would I give you? Be maniacal about how you're spending your time. And if you're not spending it the right way, dive into why and spend a little bit of time figuring out how you can spend your time better. And chief of staff might be the answer for you. It might not, but it'll probably lead to some changes in decision making.
So what is the biggest red flag in a chief of staff candidate?
Somebody who is not proactive. If you're not hearing them say, I saw this opportunity, so I took action, or I identified this, or I came to my leader with this, or I solved this problem and here's how. Bias for action is key. And taking the initiative to suggest changes or to make changes, strategically recommend next steps is really, really important. And you can flesh that out in conversation for sure.
What's the best book or the number one book that you would recommend that an entrepreneur should read before hiring a chief of staff?
Oh my goodness. Well, Traction is very well aligned. So Gino Wickman, like big believer in kind of that integrator model. It's foundational. Like you as a leader need to have somebody doing the integrating, and whether you call it a chief of staff or an integrator, I don't believe that you need EOS model to be successful in your company. I think it's one way to help you apply structure to what you're doing. But I would say, kind of those philosophies around like rocket fuel and Traction, I would probably go there if it's chief of staff related.
What's one myth about the chief of staff role that needs to die?
That you can just make your EA a chief of staff.
Oh, that's how I started this conversation.
We brought it back.
We brought it all the way back. Well, Maggie, let's tell people how to get in touch with you, because there's two reasons why people would want to talk to you. This audience is probably more interested in talking to you because they want a chief of staff. But some people here may say, you know what, that's me. I want to be a chief. I don't want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be a chief of staff. So how would they get in touch with you, and where's the best place to connect?
Absolutely. So we train teams, we train individuals, and a lot of EAs make incredible chiefs of staff. And that's a lot of who are in our course. But I think you just need to think critically about that, right? So you can get in touch with us at novachiefofstaff.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I post about the chief of staff role every single day. Maggie-Olson. It's OLSON-COS. And I think that's really it for now.
All right. Well, Maggie, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. I like to give guests the very last word before I do all the outro crap that I normally have to do at the end. So I'm going to give you the very last word before I do all that. So it's up to you.
Well, how about just like have an incredible day and learn something and be maniacal with your time. And if chief of staff's the answer, reach out. We're happy to help here at Nova.
Big thanks to Maggie for being on the show today. Thank you, listener, for listening in on the podcast player of your choice or watching this on YouTube. The Root of All Success is designed to interview some of the world's greatest leaders, most successful people who've built things, done things, who've created things. And Maggie has our great story today about leaving the corporate world and deciding there's an opportunity. And I think she said it was her mom, if I remember, about, well, go do it, go build it. Who's the person in your life that's giving you that push? Go do something. Well, go do it. And think about this. If you follow my content, you know that I lead the mastermind, the Exiter Club. I wrote the book Exit Without Exiting. And a lot of what we talk about in my methodology, the XOS methodology, Exeter Operating System, is you've got to get your support squad together and build an A team. And guess what, people? Chief of staff is going to be on your A team. So if you want a chief of staff, reach out to Maggie Olson. Big thanks for her being on the show. Make sure you subscribe, leave a review, do all the things that us podcasters ask for. And by the way, we do it because it helps us get in front of more people. It is prideful for us to say, oh yeah, we got 8,000 5-star reviews, but those reviews get us in front of more people. So please leave a review if you found this helpful today. Please tune in again next week when we talk with yet another very successful person about his or her journey to success. But until then, as always, I am the real Jason Duncan, and Jesus is King.
Attention business owners. Attention business owners. Feeling burnout from running your business? Uncertain if you're nearing burnout? Take our free 10-question business burnout test at businessburnouttest.com to discover where you stand. With just 10 quick questions, you'll learn how to immediately begin making changes to regain freedom and success. Cut your daily operations time in half. Improve your quality of life and prepare your business for your future exit without losing revenue or profit. Visit businessburnouttest.com now and take the test. Thank you for listening to another edition of The Root of All Success with the real Jason Duncan. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, visit therootofallsuccess.com to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Follow Jason on social media at The Real Jason Duncan. See you again next time here on The Root of All Success.